Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. Ryan is a family man, first and foremost, but he's also a pastor, publisher, and serial entrepreneur. This podcast will help you think, work, and create like never before.
Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. This is Ryan Frank, and thank you so much for tuning in. Do you ever feel like you've just blown it? Well, you know what? You're in good company because we all have. We've all blown it at times. That's what our topic's about today. Brian Dollar, our friend and ministry partner, has just released an updated, revised version of his book, I Blew It. Boy, it's going to be, this conversation is amazing. And the book is amazing. If you feel like you've blown it before and you feel like, you know what, I'm just a failure, don't stay there. You're not a failure. You're a student, right? Grow through the failure. Allow the Lord to use that in your life to make you better. That's what today's conversation is about. Whether you're a ministry leader, a marketplace leader, a stay-at-home mom, whatever, a student, whatever you do, you're going to find so much value in my conversation today with Brian Dollar. Brian is the creator of High Voltage Kids Ministry. He is the associate pastor at First Assembly of God in North Little Rock, Arkansas. He is a family friend. He is a frequent speaker at the Kids Matter conference. He'll be there this fall. And I dearly appreciate every time I have the opportunity to speak with Brian, and today is no exception. Now, before we jump into today's conversation, thank you so much for tuning in. I want to make sure that you and I are connected on social media, whether it's on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter. I'm about everywhere, and if you haven't found me on your favorite social channel, please find me. All the links can be found at ryanfrank.com. Let's make sure we stay connected. I'm posting videos and content every day to help you in your life and leadership journey. Also want to invite you to join us at the Kids Matter Conference happening September 12th, 13th, and 14th in Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to have a wonderful event with a record attendance, over 200 specialized ministry breakouts, 6 inspiring main stage sessions, over 90 ministry partners, vendors, resource providers going to be there to show you some of the latest and greatest to help you lead children's ministry. Someone's even going to win a Mini Cooper. But you can't win it if you're not there. It's going to be a wonderful time. This conference is a conference that you can't miss. You need to be there and bring your children's ministry team. To get registered and learn more, go over to thekidsmatterconference.com. Now, are you ready to talk about how you ought to respond the next time you blow it? Or how do you deal with guilt and shame and regret over mistakes of the past? Do you want to try to avoid future mistakes? I hope that you do, and you're in a good spot today. Let's jump right in. Let's get this show on the road. Here is the conversation that I had with Brian Dollar, the author of the revised version of I Blew It. Hey, what's up, Brian? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, my friend. I'm excited to be here. It's been at least a few months since we've really talked in depth, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And I should have said welcome back, because you're a frequent flyer here on the podcast. So
I have been on once or twice.
I guess you must do a decent job.
Well, hopefully people won't feel like they're hearing too much of me.
So Brian, it's summer, back to school time. Have you had a good summer?
Yeah, we've had a great summer at the church that I serve at. Been there 23 plus years, and
Wow.
Man, we actually are having what is rare in the church world, and that's a summer of growth. We've actually grown this summer,
Man.
and been doing a big, huge kind of overhaul of our entire sanctuary. And even despite all that upside down stuff, we're still growing. So the Lord's been faithful. It's been fun.
Have you been doing some events? Like, do you feel like that's what's bringing these new people?
No, we haven't done any events actually. It's
just church as normal.
Well, it's not been church as normal necessarily, but just God's doing big stuff every weekend, and
Yeah.
Dude, we're having tons of people saved left and right every week, 25, 30 people coming to the Lord and joining the church. It's just crazy. It's been a great season.
God's good. That's great. Brian, I know a lot of the people that watch or listen to this podcast are kid men, children's ministry people, and they know you from Kids Matter Conference, or they've used high voltage kids curriculum. But take just a minute. I don't want to assume that everybody knows Brian Dollar. So take a minute, tell us about your family, tell us about your church, and then we're going to jump into the topic today.
Okay. Well, I've been in ministry for just over 30 years. Started in Dallas, Texas at a church while I was attending Bible college. And then I was there about 8.5 years as kids pastor, came to North Little Rock, Arkansas, where I've been at First Assembly of God Church for the last 23 plus years, about to be 24 in October. Yep. And, you know, I serve currently as the associate pastor. I lead a dozen plus ministries with over 500 volunteers in a church. Several thousand. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know where we're at right now, but the fact is, we're just focused on winning people to the Lord and building lifelong followers of Jesus.
I love it.
And we're in a great season. I've got a wife, Sherith, who I've been married to for 25 plus years. Yeah. Our daughter Ashton got married a little over a year ago to one of our actual staff members, one of our other pastors on staff with us. He was actually one of the kids in my kids ministry growing up too, so that's pretty neat.
Yep.
And my son Jordan's about to graduate college, and he'll be coming on full time with us as our media director. But overall, I'm just loving life and having a great time right now.
I love it. And today we're talking about the updated version of your book, a new revised, I'm going to call it revised or updated version of I Blew It.
Revised and updated is what it says on the front. You know, 10 years ago, I released the book I Blew It, which was all about the biggest mistakes I've made in ministry and how you can avoid them. And it was a bestseller, did really, really well. It's been 10 years and I got a little bit more perspective on failure and overcoming failure, and especially just learning more and more lessons about being on a staff. You know, after almost a quarter century on the same staff, you go through a lot of seasons of failure, growth, just understanding interpersonal relationships. And that's what a lot of the book is about, is failure when it comes to leading people and being led, as well as serving with others. Because we work with people, so we're bound to mess up, and
no doubt
learn from those mistakes and move forward. So
Brian, how did you get your publisher to fit all of those mistakes of yours into one book? Was it tough?
Yeah, it started off as an encyclopedia.
That's what I figured. Yeah.
But we ended up making it into just one book, so it worked out.
In all seriousness, I love the book. I can't wait to see. I've seen a preview copy, a digital one, of your updated book. I Blew It. You know, in the book, you share some funny stories. You also share, though, some serious things that you regret and you wish you would have done different. What prompted you to talk about mistakes that you've made and that you've seen others make? And what prompted you to really help leaders embrace those mistakes and learn from them?
Well, I wrote the book initially in response to celebrating my 20th year in full-time ministry. But, I didn't want to celebrate in that. I noticed a lot of books out there about people's successes and here's all the great things I've done. And, everybody wants to talk about their successes. But the fact is, failure is what shapes us. Where we fall down and we learn from our mistakes, that's really what molds our character. And so I realized that there were not enough books out there that were written from a perspective of, you see me as this guy who's accomplished this, and this, but what you don't recognize is all of the failures along the way. Ryan, you know this, failure is inevitable. in ministry. I mean, if
100%. It's
if
yeah,
you're if you're
it's
trying,
not it will I fail, right?
well,
We're gonna
yeah,
fail. Yeah.
it is exactly failure. We work with people.
Yeah.
We're going to have moments where we don't respond correctly, where we make the wrong assumption about somebody's motive, or we drop the ball with a ministry assignment. I mean,
Yeah.
we're going to make mistakes consistently, but we have to learn as leaders how to manage those mistakes and to work to minimize the negative impact of those mistakes. And so, as a leader, I feel it's all about how we respond to our mistakes, and that's what prompted me to really write this book.
Yeah, man, that's good. Your response. I think of, is it in Psalms or Proverbs, where a righteous man falls 7 times but gets up again, right? It's not that how many times you trip and fall. It's that you keep getting back up and learning from those mistakes. Brian, when we talk about mistakes, I want to be sensitive. I'm sure there are some people that maybe are watching or listening to the podcast, and they hear mistakes in ministry, and it brings up what they would at least call a life-defining mistake. Man, I blew it bad, and it brings up hurt and pain and regret. What would you say to someone like that, just to encourage them and remind them that it's not the end, that there's hope and help?
Yeah, failures come in all shapes and sizes, and I know a lot of people who their failure knocked them out of ministry altogether. They allowed it to overshadow and overcome them, and they ended up just feeling like, well, if I've blown it like this, I got to just quit.
Yeah.
I mean, there are big mistakes, and there's also, the everyday mistakes. If you forgot to do something, or you promised something to somebody and then you just dropped the ball, maybe you had the wrong attitude, or, even had a budgetary financial mistake that cost the church money. Those things, you can learn from, but you can also learn from the big, huge mistakes of sin and failure and truly falling short. I think it's crucial that when we approach those moments, that we do so with humility and a readiness to learn, because failure really is simply a process. I think it's oversimplification just to call it a stepping stone, but it is a step in the pursuit of God's vision for our lives and our community. It's an opportunity for us to kind of lean into faith and refine our methods, our communication, our understanding. My advice to leaders is, let's embrace our failures. Let's know that those failures can lead to a deeper wisdom, a stronger resolve, and really a faith that's more tested and more true. After all, it's in our weaknesses that God can show himself to be strong.
Yeah.
He hadn't called you to be perfect, Ryan. You know that.
100%.
The question isn't, are you going to make mistakes? Because we're all going to blow it. It's not will you blow it. It's how will you respond when you blow it. Will you try to cover it up and pretend like it didn't happen? Will you argue your point and refuse to see things from a different perspective? Or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, will you bury your head in your pillow and just cry yourself to sleep because you feel like you just can't get it right?
Yeah.
Those are negative ways to respond to failure. But if you're truly going to let failure in ministry be what I believe God intended for it to be, you need to own it, you need to dig into it, and you need to learn from your mistakes.
And don't you think, Brian, so true? I think back on times as a young leader where I would blow it, I would make a mistake, and I didn't want pastor to know, I didn't want my leader to know, or I'd try to cover it up. I'd be afraid I'd get in trouble, lose credibility, lose respect. When truthfully, I think most pastors and leaders, supervisors, managers, whatever your situation is, if you'll humbly own your mistake and, hey, this is what I've learned from it, and I'm going to do better, I don't think you lose credibility in that. I think you gain it. Don't you, Brian?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know that in my early years, my tendency was to go into scramble mode whenever I made a mistake. You know, if my pastor asked me about something and I knew I had failed in it, I wouldn't lie, but I would just start, you know, I call it scramble mode, because you're moving stuff around, trying to just distract from the fact that you messed up and say, oh yeah, I'm going to do that whenever I go. And you just start blubbering and instead of saying, you know what, forgot all about that. If you'll give me till tomorrow, I will focus today on making sure I get that done. Let me tell you, when you do the latter rather than the former, it elevates you in their eyes, not diminishes your leadership capacity, because they're recognizing you're not going to try and bluff your way through stuff, because they realize if you're doing that to me, your pastor, your leader, what are you doing to the people you're leading when you blow it with them? You're going into that scramble mode, and they're looking at you like, I don't even want to be on this guy's team. I'm leaving.
Exactly.
You know? And so that's why you got to own it. You got to figure out what you did wrong. And there's a whole process that I share in the book about how to move through what I call the 4 phases of failure. And you know, it's important that you not skip a step on that.
So true. The book is I Blew It. By the time this podcast drops, it's going to be hot off the press, available on Amazon, at highvoltagekids.com, anywhere online like that. And you'll have them at the Kids Matter conference, right?
Yeah, Ryan? I will have them. That's actually going to be before it releases. It releases September 18th, and I'll have it at the Kids Matter conference as a pre-release. Those will be the first people to be able to get it in their hands. And they can also, if people want to pre-order it, they can go to briandollar.com. And I've got a link there that they can pre-order it. And I think all of our pre-orders we're doing autographed copies. So that's nice. Not only you get a discount, but you get an autographed copy. So that's pretty good.
Yeah. So your book will automatically devalue by the time you get it it will increase in value.
Wow.
I love you, Brian. No, that's really neat. I would go pre-order that book. Go over to briandollar.com, BRIAN.
Yes.
Pre-order it. Brian will sign it for you. That'll be really, really special. And it'll be a great way to support Brian in his ministry. Brian, in the book, you share, some mistakes that you've made. What's one in particular, maybe a significant one that you made that you learned from it and you grew as a result?
Well, it's the one that when people hear the story, they really believe that I'm making it up or that I'm embellishing it, and there's no way it happened like this. You've heard the story before, but I'll tell it for your listeners, your viewers. I was asked to be the lead in our Easter production. What I was doing was I was the narrator, dressed in full biblical costume. And I mean, it was before Passion of the Christ. So it was like everybody was doing these big, huge Easter productions. Yeah. And, Passion of the Christ came on and ruined it for everybody, because it was like, we could never
be like that.
Yeah. So, but I was supposed to come out and just explain what was happening, periodically. Well, there was this whole period of time where nothing was happening on the stage. I say nothing was happening. It wasn't my part, because Jesus was being crucified and put on the cross, kind of an important part of the whole thing. But I was backstage and I didn't have anything to narrate. So I was waiting back there, and my identity back then was the staff funny guy. I was always Mr. Comedian, trying to make everybody laugh. I was in children's ministry at the time, full time, and I was really, leaning into my humor gift. And so I saw this prop backstage, and it was a Keystone Cop hat that was like left over from one of our past Christmas performances or whatever.
Okay. Yeah.
And I don't know what possessed me, but I decided I was going to walk into our media room. Again, I'm waiting on my time to go out on the stage. And so I walked into our media room where our youth pastor and our junior high pastor were in. And I put that stupid Keystone Cop hat on my head. Now, keep in mind, I still got my whole biblical costume on.
Okay. Yeah.
But I put it on my head and walked in there, and I'm like, trying to be funny.
Yeah.
And I did, they laughed. Well, I got sucked into the TV monitor and was just kind of watching everything happening on stage. And suddenly I realized, I've got like 15 seconds before I got to be on stage. Yeah. So I immediately walked out of the media room and walked on stage and began giving my lines. What I had forgotten to do was remove that Keystone Cop hat off of my head. I completely, because I had this really tight headdress. I didn't even feel it sitting up there. Like I'd lost all feeling on my head anyway. And I had no idea. I'm out speaking to thousands and I'm saying Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, put Jesus into Joseph's own tomb. I'm giving
how did people respond?
Well, here's the deal. I got this big bright light in my face. I can't see the audience.
Yeah.
And so all I see is the orchestra pit below me. And I see our drummer, Mike. He was kind of looking at me. And again, I didn't realize I had it on my head. I'm just talking. I'm giving they're putting Jesus in the tomb. It's a serious moment. And Mike's looking at me like, and I'm like, what? Why is he looking at me like that?
Yeah.
I know my lines. I'm doing this right. Well, about 10, 15 seconds into it, after he continued to look at me with that face, I look up at the screen and I see the giant Keystone Cop hat on my head. I'll have to send you the picture so you can throw it up.
You have a picture of it?
This video.
You have a picture?
But it was crazy. I couldn't believe it. And I mean, my heart sunk. And I just knew I'm fired. I'm dead. Well, as God would only be able to put together, when somehow I kept it together and I finished my lines, but I turned to walk off stage. In order to leave the stage, I had to walk down this plank. I literally had to walk the plank.
Okay.
And at the bottom of the plank on the front row sat my lead pastor, Rod. And he's sitting there and I'm like, I know he's thinking, what is wrong with this guy? He's ruining this production. It's the most important moment.
Yeah.
And he's ruining it. And I walk by and I lean over and I go, I'm sorry, it was an accident. And I walk out. Well, my pastor is like the master of the deadpan expression. Like you never know what he's thinking.
Okay. Yeah.
And so he gave me no response.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I freaked out when I got out in the hallway and I'm yelling at the student pastors. I'm like, why didn't y'all tell me? You know? And they're like, we didn't think you'd be so stupid as to leave it on your head when you walked out there. Well, I didn't realize it was on there. So I ended up writing an apology note and sending it in to Pastor Rod. He opens it, still no response, all this.
Yeah.
Well, I get to after the production, I finally get a chance to be one-on-one with him and I apologize. I'm like, I'm sorry. It took him a while to believe that it was an accident, but he said, okay, hey, accidents happen. I get it. Well, you'd think that's the worst of the story.
Mm.
But what happened next was just the worst. I walked into the media room. I asked our media director to rewind the tape and show me what it looked like. And when he did, I'm laughing. Some people came in hearing the laugh and I told him to rewind it again. Like after 10 times rewinding this, there's like 30 people crammed into the media room, laughing our heads off. And in mid laugh, I look up and I see my pastor standing at the door looking at me like, really? You really felt bad about this, huh? And he turned and walked down to his office. I walked the walk of shame.
I bet it crushed you.
Yeah, well, I sat in front of him and I said, I realized what I did was wrong.
Yeah. And
I promised to learn from this. And he looked at me and Ryan, I'll never forget his words. And I mean, exactly this is what he said. He said, Brian, I see the potential for leadership in you. And I would love to elevate you in areas of leadership here at First Assembly. But every time you pull a stunt like this, you tie my hands.
Hmm.
And I realized that what I'd done and what I share in that chapter in the book is that, I had found my identity in being the funny guy. Yeah. And I allowed my greatest asset to become my greatest liability.
Yeah.
And, my cute little attempt at being funny with my friends had ruined a very important production. And it had caused people to question my wisdom and my leadership. Yeah. The greatest strength that I thought I had was my humor. The children loved it. The volunteers enjoyed it. I was able to play a bunch of goofy characters, in kids ministry. But here's the deal. I allowed that strength to run wild and unrestrained in my life, and it became a huge liability. And, everybody can have that happen. It doesn't have to be humor. A person who's driven, who just is always chasing after their vision. Think about it. If they allow that to become too strong in their life, they end up leaving a trail of ruined relationships behind because they're more focused on the priority than the people. They may accomplish their goals, but they hurt the people in the process. There's a lot of strengths that you can have in your life that when taken to an extreme, and it isn't tempered by wisdom and by love, it can become detrimental to you, your team, and your organization. So that's an example of just one of the mistakes and stories that I share, but then I turn and give a lot of principles of how that really shaped and molded me throughout the process. So
that's such a good example. And I forgot that story. And thanks for sharing it. That's just one of the kind of stories you're going to find in the book. Go over to briandollar.com and pre-order it. Brian, thanks for sharing. I think you're right. You had, in that story you just shared, you felt you had some feelings of shame and guilt, which we've all experienced with mistakes that we've made at times. What would you say to someone, or to all of us, in those times where we make mistakes and we have feelings of shame and guilt? How do you deal with those emotions biblically before the Lord so that you get to a place of hope, where you're discovering hope in restoration, and you're moving forward?
Really, we said this is the revised and updated version of the book, and I added 2 new chapters.
Did you?
And this is the focus. I realized that I didn't deal enough with the aftermath. Like I went through a lot of the mistakes I made and how you can avoid them, and then also just principles that'll help you along the way. But I didn't deal enough with this part because it's a big deal. When you fail, it's easy to get wrapped up in the emotion of it all and to have it just weigh you down. And what you have to do is you've got to recognize that failure is something you did. It's not something you are. It's not your identity. The action that you took ended up screwing things up. But that doesn't define who you are as a child of God, as a leader of people, and just as a man or woman who's following God's plan. Moses, he had to go through a period of really, he spent 40 years after he killed the guy and ran away to go, tend sheep in the wilderness. It was 40 years that he sat there just letting his life rot away because he was just so convinced it was all over. And when God spoke to him through the burning bush and commanded him to go lead the Israelites out of captivity, you get a sense and you get a little insight as to what failure can really do to a person, because all he did was just continually make excuses of, nah, you don't mean me. I can't do it because this. I can't do it because, you don't understand the shortcomings I now have. He was convinced that this failure had ruined him and that there's no way that he could do it. And ultimately at the end, we find a little bit of what the real issue was. He was scared. He had become so familiar with the wilderness that he was afraid to turn the page and move into the next chapter that God had for him. And so I want everybody who's really blown it, and maybe they've allowed the emotion of that failure or even what other people have said to define who they are in their own mind. Failure does not have to define you. Now, failure should change you, but failure should propel you into that next opportunity to lean into God's strength and plan for your life. Allow him to do that.
I heard a pastor say once that you're not a failure, you're a student, and goes right along with that. You're not a failure. You're a student. You learn from it, grow, change. Brian, don't you think part of this is part of learning from your failures is understanding the root causes so that you don't repeat them? What advice would you give to someone to really help them analyze their mistakes so that they don't keep making the same errors over and over again?
Man, excellent question. we all hate to make mistakes, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think the response that we have to both small and large mistakes is largely the same. I think the key is you have to make a commitment to avoid wasting your mistakes, because there's some of the best learning opportunities that you have in life and in ministry.
True.
Whenever I mess up, there's 4 important questions that I ask. One, I ask, why did it happen? Was it a lack of planning? Was it that I had unrealistic expectations? Maybe poor communication, wrong motives, unforeseen obstacles, some other reason. But why did it happen? 2, was it avoidable? Because a lot of our mess ups can really be avoided if we just had planned better, if we'd have thought a little more about it, or maybe executed in a different way. So, why did it happen? Was it avoidable? If it could be avoided, then I have to ask, what specifically could I have done to prevent it? So it kind of helps me see the steps I might have missed. And then finally, what do I need to know, be, or do to avoid repeating the mistake?
Mm-hmm.
Those 4 questions, I think, help a lot. But if I can, when I was thinking about this whole aftermath idea, and it's something I desperately wish I would have included in the book, but it kind of came to me after the book was done. But I believe there are 4 phases of the aftermath that we need to go through, and you can't skip one. It's almost like grief. Grief is in phases, and you can't skip them. You got to go through them all if you're going to truly be over it. Well, the 4 phases of failure. Phase number 1 is commiseration. Commiseration is where you are feeling the feelings, man. It's like, oh, I'm an idiot, I blew it. I really believe that you have to go through that commiseration feeling, where you're commiserating all of the emotions that were involved with it, and spend enough time wallowing in the failure in order to get a true sense of what was lost or what was damaged as a result of your failure. I think if you don't understand the damage you caused, you're bound to repeat the failure.
So true. So true.
So that phase of commiseration, a lot of people never leave it, but I think you have to go through it. So don't avoid it. Commiserate, feel all the feelings, but then I think within a day or so, you should get out of that commiseration phase and on to phase 2, examination. And that is what I just kind of talked through, where you're asking those questions. Why did it happen? What steps did I miss? What roadblocks did I blow through? Part of that examination can be asking some people that you work with, hey, what do you see that I could have done better? But examine the mistake. What caused it? What could you do better? And then, because people were hurt and stuff fell through the cracks as a result of your mistake. Phase 3, reconciliation. So you gotta go through the commiseration, you gotta go through the examination, but then you gotta go through the reconciliation, where you speak to the person or group of people who were hurt by your mistake. If you lied to somebody, go to them and say, I led you astray with that. I didn't tell the truth. I was trying to cover up for my mistake, and I lied. If you forgot to follow through on something, tell your boss. Come clean with an official apology. And Ryan, I learned this from my pastor. He said there are 3 components to a real apology, not a half-hearted, sorry you're offended kind of apology. But a real apology is, I'm sorry, I was wrong. What can I do to make it right? I think if you miss any of those pieces of the apology, it's not a real apology. I'm sorry, I was wrong. What can I do to make it right? That's part of the reconciliation phase. And then after you've reconciled, phase 4, preparation. Preparation is where you're preparing for the future. You're putting safeguards in place so that mistake doesn't happen again. You're getting spiritually prepared to lean on God's grace and not your own. And you're turning the page, leaving the past behind, and moving forward. I think those phases of the aftermath of failure are super important. So again, they're commiseration, examination, reconciliation, and preparation.
And just like a preacher, I mean, they all end in IONs. Great. Those are 4 practical points. That was worth a podcast right there.
Yeah.
And that's so good. Because you're right. So much of your success in life and ministry is going to be, how do you respond to the mistakes?
Yeah.
Are you willing to walk through these 4 steps? Brian, we have, I'm sure a lot of new leaders, new people watching or listening to the podcast. Maybe they're new on church staff. Maybe they have a new role, and they find themselves at a new church. Some people that this is my first, church staff job. And how would you encourage someone that perhaps is afraid to put themselves out there because they're afraid to fail, or they're afraid to try that new idea, or to try something different, or have that difficult conversation? Because, boy, what if I fail? I mean, I do want to be empathetic to those that really struggle with this. How would you encourage that person?
Well, first of all, I understand it. I've been through it. The fear of failure and the fear of losing face, I think, is something that plagues every young leader, because you're just trying to prove yourself, and you're trying to, somehow prove that I can be trusted, and I can get more and more. I can get more responsibility. And so, the problem is, by doing that, by trying to fake it, cover up your failures, and kind of bow up and show I can handle this, you're taking a route that's completely opposite of what Jesus said.
That's
Jesus didn't say, if you promote yourself enough, then you'll get made ruler over much. He didn't say, if you'll just convince everybody that you're infallible and can make no mistakes and that you're perfect, then they'll really trust you with great responsibility. No, he said, be faithful. Be faithful in the small things, and he'll make you ruler over much. Not others will. He will elevate you. He will make you ruler over much. And so that fear of failure is something that I think drives us to be very self-reliant, and to try to make things happen on our own. I'll tell you what failure's done for me is it's made me much more gentle. I didn't deserve the grace that I've been shown. About 15 years ago, I had a massive failure in life and ministry, and really I almost lost everything. And I was shown such grace, and I should have been fired. Really, when you read the book, you're going to be like, dude, how's this guy still have a job? He should have been fired multiple times. And yet here I am on the same staff, serving the same church 23 years later.
Promoted.
Yeah. And I'm associate pastor now, in spite of what happened in the past. See, failure helps you see mistakes as opportunities for growth, not just for yourself, but for others. You'll be a better leader if you'll respond to failure in the biblical way. See, I have a much better sense of guiding people through their failures now. I'm a better leader, a better counselor, and a better friend, because I've let failure do what it was meant to do, and that is mold and shape me into being a much more God-reliant person, not a self-reliant person.
Yeah.
And so that's my advice to young leaders is, don't try to prove yourself. You be faithful. God will prove you through that.
Yeah, so good, Brian.
That's what it's all about.
Thank you for sharing that. The book is I Blew It, a revised version that you can get an early copy of by going to briandollar.com. You'll also be able to pick up a copy at the Kids Matter Conference in advance of the official release date. So looking forward to that. Brian, and I Blew It, you share all kinds of principles and steps for moving beyond failures. There is hope beyond failure.
Yeah.
Your failures do not have to define you. You've already shared so many good principles and takeaways, but I'm wondering, is there one big takeaway from the book that you think is especially life-changing for people that want to grow and even seek restoration past their mistakes. If there was one key takeaway or principle, what would it be? And
You know, I think
it might be something you've already said, and that's okay. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, I think I can sum it up in this. I think you might remember, I don't remember how many years ago, but Lance Armstrong had these Live Strong bracelets that everybody wore. It was kind of this movement of Live Strong. What I've decided to embrace, and what I suggest everybody who is either an aspiring leader, or even if you've been in this thing a long time, rather than live strong, recognize your innate ability to screw up and choose to live weak. What I mean by live weak is following what 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10 says. Paul said, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power, that's Jesus talking, my power is made perfect in weakness. Not in putting a varnished version of yourself out there, not in trying to cover up your mistakes and act like you're perfect, but in admitting your weakness, admitting your failures. He said, my power is made perfect in that. Therefore, Paul, who was just the greatest, most amazing apostle and missionary ever, he said, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly, not in my accomplishments, not in my successes, but he said, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses.
So true.
So that Christ's power may rest on me.
I love that.
It's not about what you've accomplished. It's not about the successes in your ministry. It's about what have you learned when you failed and when you've fallen short. Because I don't know if you've read it recently, but Romans 3:23 said we all have fallen short over and over and over and over again.
Every one of us.
Every one of us. And so don't try to be something that God never expected you to be. And that's perfect. Instead, embrace weakness, live weak, and let God's power shine through you as you model for others what it looks like to move through failures and mistakes to a place of more God reliance and less self-reliance.
Friends, if you think this conversation's been good, you got to get the book. I love talking with Brian Dollar. Brian, you're a great friend. You're a great leader. God has given you so much wisdom, and I love seeing how God is working in and through you. Let's wrap up the podcast, Brian. I always like to ask 2 questions. I've asked you these questions before, several months ago on the podcast. First, what's your favorite Bible story and why? Now, before you share, I remember the Bible story you shared last time. So I'm curious if it stayed the same or if it's moved or shifted. Let's hear it. Favorite Bible story right now.
Well, it will never cease to be my favorite story.
John 21.
I'm sorry?
John 21.
Yes, and that's all in response to Peter's failure. And so it just works with this conversation, especially.
It does.
Peter blew it so bad, man. He didn't just answer a question wrong or not quite stand up for God. He literally said, I don't know Jesus. I don't know who you're talking about. Talk about a failure. He blew it big time. And then Jesus, without even, what I love about John 21 and what I love about the entire experience of Peter's restoration is that Jesus, he doesn't require him to spell out what he did wrong. Jesus doesn't even mention it. Instead, Jesus just looks straight at Peter and says, you are going to feed my lambs. You are going to do the work that I've called you to do. And I'm not even going to look at what how you failed in the past, because here you are. Yeah, you blew it. And yeah, you ran, but you're here in front of me now. And you're willing to learn. And so Peter's restoration of being able to go from a guy who was the furthest thing from a strong leader, able to make an impact in the kingdom, to ultimately from that restoration moment goes to lead thousands of people to Jesus in one sermon. That's a pretty huge bounce back from failure moment. So sorry, it's the same story because it's kind of my life story as well.
Exactly. And it's such a good story. All right. Yes. And it ties perfect with the book. And I love that too. I mean, you're not a failure. You're not a failure. You're not a failure.
Right.
God's not done with you yet. If you'll, but you need to take these steps. So go back and listen to those 4 steps and respond biblically and grow and change through it and allow God to do a work in your life. Brian, what's something big that you're working on right now? Is it the book, or is there anything else you want to share?
The book is complete, and it will release September 19th, 2023.
Yeah.
But what I've been working on and almost done with it is a masterclass based on the book. It's not just a regurgitation. I don't sit there and read you the book, but I give you some stuff that wasn't included. I really kind of unpack and expand in a lot more practical ways. Each one of the mistakes that I made. And again, it's for staff pastors. What I have really loved about this book is that a lot of lead pastors have bought copies for their entire staff. And then as a staff, they walked through it. This masterclass is something that I think is going to help them to do that even better, in that they'll be able to there's 10 parts to the masterclass. It's video driven. There's some practical, worksheets and just a lot of stuff, tools that I throw into it. But they can get this masterclass if they go to briandollar.com. There's a link there that they can order it. And I think it'll be huge to help people really digest the material in the book and take it to the next level.
I love it. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Brian. Thanks so much. Friends, go check out briandollar.com. Check out the masterclass along with that book. You can get a signed copy if you order it early. And those of you that'll be at the Kids Matter conference, you can say hi to Brian. He's going to be there, going to be speaking. Brian, can't wait to see you in just a few short weeks. Thanks so much for your time, Brian.
Do what?
Thanks so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation. I know it's had to have helped a ton of people.
It's my honor. And thank you, Ryan, for not just being a great friend, but you're just such a huge blessing to the children's ministry and really ministry at large. I know a lot of people who have truly been blessed by your leadership. And I thank you for everything you do to help resource us all.
Hey, thank you, Brian. Friends, thanks for tuning in today. We'll talk to you next time.
This episode of the Ryan Frank Podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more conversations to help you stay on the leading edge. And if you like what you've heard, please rate this podcast with 5 stars. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you next time.